Well, I'll go ahead and kick things off. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you all. Sending out wishes this evening for safety and peace. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Allison Green Myers. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the program director here at the Highlights Foundation, and I would like to welcome you all to our November Highlights Foundation Gather. With me tonight from the Highlights Foundation team on the screen is George Brown, our executive director. Hi, George. And I see just tons of our Highlights Foundation team members in the chat giving their hellos. Hello to all of you. A note for you as our gathered guests, as a webinar, we cannot see your video or hear your audio during the session. And as I mentioned, right now, the chat feature is set to hosts and panelists, but we'll open that up so that everyone can respond in just about another moment. But everyone does have access to the Q&A feature, which is where we would love for you to put questions if you have questions for the panelists tonight. I want to let you know that captions will be included in the recording of tonight's program that will be sent out to all of you. And if you're here with us, we can see those hellos as the panelists and as the hosts. And as I said, in just a moment, I'll open it up for everyone. And in that Q&A feature, we'll get to as many questions as possible. So many came in pre-event, and I can only imagine how many will go in the Q&A feature. Just a reminder, in these spaces, in our chat, on Zoom, anywhere we come together as the Highlights Foundation, we ask for your respectful engagement. We strive for a safe and inclusive environment at the Highlights Foundation, and that means joining tonight and always with no hate, no harm, and no harassment of any kind. Let's take good care of one another. Let's look for ways that we can listen to and amplify the voices of storytellers all along our way. Tonight really is all about listening to and amplifying the voices of storytellers. Tonight we are welcoming the gifted and gracious voices who have given us stories like Repairing the World and Meemaw and Ghost Girl, Linda Epstein and Amber McBride and Ally Malinenko. Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for being with us at this month's gather. I thought we could start off in the place we all love, which is story. And maybe you could introduce yourself a little bit, introduce us to your stories a little, and then we'll get into our conversation about writing about trauma and grief for kids. Amber, would you like to begin?
Sure. Hello. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Amber McBride. I wrote Meemaw, which is back there. And I also have my upcoming book that comes out in January called We're All So Good at Smiling. And We're Also Good at Smiling is specifically about clinical depression. It's something that I have and something that I've struggled with my entire life. And Meemaw also deals with grief, a girl who lost her entire family in a car crash. But I'm going to read a little bit of a poem from the first poem of We're Also Good at Smiling. It's one of my first times doing this, so I'm kind of excited to finally be reading from a new and different book. But to give this some context, or in this one, the main character's name is Whimsy, and she is back in the hospital for treatment for clinical depression. This poem is called Call Me Whimsy. This is something difficult. I'm here again in the hospital and my uniform changes. No jewelry. They took my quartz necklace. White shirt. They confiscated my black one. White pants. My black ones had too many pockets. White shoes that showed too much dirt. Gloveless, bookless, dirtless, and moonless. Feeling less, less, less. This is the thing. Sometimes it gets bad. Roots mingle with strange soil and you don't trust your hands with your skin. Sometimes that means you're admitted to a hospital to be watched and watched and watched and to talk and talk and talk and sometimes break. It's like Grandma said when I sat legs crossed like cherry stems at the edge of the forest where toothy fog had already begun to seep into the soil. Hoodoo is real, witches and fae people too. Fairy tales are real. Magic is real, but be careful, Whimsy. Sometimes your own mind will unroot you. This is what I think. I am Whimsy. I am magic just like my name, but I'm not whimsical anymore. So yeah.
Amber, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great.
Who's next?
Ally, would you like to share with us a little, read with us a little?
Sure. So, hi everybody. I'm Ally. I'm super excited to be here and to talk with these lovely people. I am the author of Ghost Girl and also Disappearing House. I'm probably going to be talking most about Disappearing House tonight. So, which is a story about a girl named Jack who's at the 5-year anniversary of a cancer diagnosis. She's 12. So she's experiencing some anxiety about that. And when a house suddenly appears at the end of her street, she's very drawn to it. And when she and her best friend go inside, they discover that they can't leave. And the house is a puzzle box, and it's for her and her alone. And she has to figure out and face her past in order to find her way through. So the part that I'm going to read is right when Jack first goes into the house for the first time. So she's seen it. She's gone up to the front steps, but she hasn't actually entered. It's her and her best friend, and she's doing this because they're being teased by some neighborhood kids. And if they go in, the kids promise they'll leave Hazel, her best friend, alone. If going in the house was going to get John off Hazel's back for the rest of the year, it was worth it. Besides, buried under that was another feeling, a softer, shivering feeling. She wanted to go in. She needed to go. She needed to know it was real. She turned toward the house, looked at the wide window eyes, the door like a mouth. She took the steps leading up to the front door slowly, acutely aware of her sneakers connecting with each step, the groan of the wood, her eyes locked on the wide front door. It looked even bigger now that she was nearly there. She reached a tentative hand out toward the fat knob on the door, looking at the spiderweb pattern, the one that had appeared on her own door. She paused, her hand hovering just centimeters above the doorknob. Go on then, John yelled. Don't waste our time. Jack took a deep breath, steeled herself, gripped it, and turned. The knob was cold, just like last time, but it yielded under her hand. It gave way, a deep click as it disengaged from its latch, and the door swung forward slowly, groaning. A smell reached her, something familiar, something that teased at a memory hidden deep inside her, something that called to her. She stepped carefully and with purpose over the threshold of the door. She heard it then, music, the sweet low call of the cello, so faint, and then even fainter, the high whisper of the violin. For a brief second, she felt like she was floating, out of balance with the world swirling around her. She took another step inside. Behind her, she could hear Hazel yelling something, but even that didn't matter. She heard only the house welcoming her, happy to have her here, a warm, throbbing beat, as if it had been waiting all this time for her to return. This, Jack thought, this is the house I have been entering always. Yes, the house said, finally. And then just behind her, the front door slammed shut.
Ally, thank you. Linda, hello.
How do I follow up with that? Hi, I'm Linda Epstein. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the author of Repairing the World. Repairing the World is a middle grade novel about a girl who loses her best friend. And the scene I'm going to read to you is when she finds that out. She's with her parents, and her parents just got a phone call. Let's sit in the car for a minute, buddy girl, Daisy's dad said gently. Something's happened and we need to talk about it. Daisy was about to argue, to say, geez, talk about what? When he gave her a look that stopped her. Daisy's dad never did that. Then he leaned down into the car and murmured something else to her mom. Daisy opened the car door and got back into the back seat. Her dad went around to the driver's side, but instead of getting in the front, behind the wheel, he got him back with her. Daisy had never seen her father in the back seat of the car before. She frowned. None of this made sense. Daisy thought about all the bad things that could have happened. Maybe something had happened to Grandma. She was old. Or Chewbacca. Oh God, I hope Chewbacca's okay, she thought. Or maybe something had happened to Aunt Toby. The thought of that made her stomach ache. Whatever it was, though, was really, really bad, she could tell. Her mouth felt dry and it was hard to swallow. Then Daisy's mom got out of the car and got in next to Daisy on the other side. This is so weird, she thought. What are they doing? She was squished in the middle between her parents, her knees sticking up a bit because she was sitting on the hump. Tell me, Daisy said. She braced herself and said in a lower voice, is it Aunt Toby? Her head felt tight, like something was squeezing it. Daisy's mom said softly, Aunt Toby's okay, lovey. Then she looked down. Her dad put his hand on her knee and squeezed. He said, it's Ruby, Daisy. What? Daisy said. That didn't make any sense. Ruby? What did that mean? Out loud, she said, what do you mean? Daisy's mom opened the car door to let some air in because it had almost immediately gotten too warm. A lady with a dog walked by on the sidewalk. A car playing music way too loud drove slowly by, and Daisy felt the booming bass until it passed and faded away. Her mom said there was an accident. She took Daisy's hand in her own two hands, opening Daisy's fingers one by one because they were clenched so tightly. An accident? Daisy stared at their intertwined hands. Her mom gently squeezed. Daisy looked up at her mom, her gaze following a tear as it slowly made its way down her mother's cheek until it dripped off her chin and then was followed by another. Her dad said, breathe, buddy girl. She gasped as the air rushed back into her lungs. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath, as if it could stop whatever was happening from happening. Come here, Daisy's mom said, pulling her in close. Her dad fidgeted in the seat next to her. He reached over and stroked her hair, placing a curl behind her ear off her face. An accident? What kind of accident? What did her mom mean? In a small voice, she asked, is she okay? But she didn't want to hear the answer. Oh, lovey, her mom said, and her dad leaned over now and was awkwardly hugging her from the other side. Daisy's mom tried to go on talking. Her mom coughed. She felt her dad swipe at his eyes and she turned, burrowing her face into her mother's hug. She got hit by a car, her mom said softly, whispering it into Daisy's ear and hugging her tighter. Her mom kind of hiccuped when she said, and she died.
Thank you, Linda. Also different, also powerful. Thank you all. I do just want to remind our group, there's so many messages in the chat right now. People are sharing, looking at the links for the books. Thank you for doing that. We're coming to you from the panel as those creatives, the women who wrote those stories. And I think that that's important to keep in mind tonight, that we're coming at this from a creative perspective. We're coming from personal experiences. And so the responses that are a part of the conversation tonight aren't going to be the clinical or research-based kind of responses. This is what comes from the service of telling stories to kids and teens. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we ask questions tonight. Even as you fill up that Q&A feature, know that we're coming to you as creatives. Coming back to the panel here, we're getting ready tomorrow actually at the Retreat Center to host a workshop called Writing to Empower Through Trauma. And I had the opportunity to talk with some of the students who were coming into that course, and a word kept coming up over and over and over again. And the word was silence. It was a really big part of kind of the experience of deciding to come to that program and deciding to empower, to write through trauma. And so, of course, it made me think about the panel tonight and about all of you coming at this topic. So I think, when we're talking about silence, especially when we're talking about grief and trauma and hurt, it's probably kind of ingrained almost to hold back those words or to hold back that hurt, whether it's protective for ourselves or protective for people that we care about or people that we love. But you all have found a way to step forward and tell these stories, to share them. So you're here. We heard your words. We know your stories. You've written through this silence. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. How did you approach writing about grief and trauma for readers in the various ways that you've decided to do so? How did you kind of break through that silence piece and offer your stories? I don't know, Ally, if you would be willing to share first.
Sure. I broke through that silence because Amber said I had to. That's a little joke. But no, Amber was absolutely crucial in the very beginning. That the reason that Disappearing House is not a file on my laptop is 100% because of her. So just, I guess, for some context, in 2014, I was diagnosed with cancer. I was in my mid-30s. It was shocking, to say the least. And I went through treatment, and I decided that I needed to talk about these things. So I wrote a book of poetry called Better Luck Next Year. And it was very, very much specifically about the experience, being the doctors, the assembly line of care. And I was like, okay, that's it. Did it, wrote the cancer book, I'm done, not a problem. And I went on and I wrote some other things. And then I continued to have scans, and I had a little bit of scare. There was a biopsy that needed to be done. And I learned then, brutally so, that trauma is elastic and it comes right back at you. And when that happened, I realized that there were a lot of things that I hadn't dealt with, a lot of things I hadn't talked about. There was this notion of what I call the cleaving. You know, it's the life before and the life after. And I realized I'd been spending a lot of time trying to smash those two things together and force my existence to be what it was before, which it can't be. It couldn't be. I was fundamentally changed by what I went through. And I realized, you know, at that point, that meant that I needed to find a way through this. So I did what I always do. I wrote, and haunted houses are usually metaphors for mental health struggles, but I thought, well, what if it was physical health? So I wrote a story about a girl who built a haunted house, and she filled it with monsters, and she locked herself inside. And I think the thing about silence is that it's dangerous. I think silence is where fear and guilt, where they live and they fester and they balloon and mushroom up. And I think that's dangerous. And I think it's dangerous for kids. And I understand that it's hard to talk about some things, but books can talk about them in ways that we can't talk about them. And the other thing is, you know, I went through what I went through, and I took a look around and I said, well, where are the books on trauma? And I couldn't find them. And I said, well, where are the books on cancer? And I found some, and they're not great. Sorry, they're not that. You know, 10,500 kids will be diagnosed under the age of 15 will be diagnosed with cancer every year. Almost all of them will survive, but we don't have stories for the kids that lived. So I wrote one.
Ally, I think that what you were saying is specifically on silence is so important because silence is alienating. And I think that it makes you feel like you're the only person going through that specific trauma. And then in that alienation specifically, I think that in myself, I found depression. Being a Black female, a Black queer female who went to a primarily white school, I didn't see any books about me, period. And I also didn't see any books that were addressing mental health, specifically depression. And so this idea of silence somehow fixing or being acceptable is something that I feel like older generations have done because they're like everyone, like I know that my mother has said something along the lines of, back when we were young, we didn't have this, this, and this. And I'm like, you also didn't have the news every 5 seconds and know what was happening around the entire world. And so this idea of speaking out and being open about mental health to me is so important. I'm a college professor at UVA, and when my students come to me saying, Amber, I can't turn my paper in on time because I can't do anything. I'm filled with so much anxiety. What I do is, let's go for a walk. Let's get some of that off. And what day do you think that could be possible? And last year I tweeted something that went viral, and a lot of people had some opinions about how I tried to give my students some autonomy over their time and their mental health. That was about, I don't have due dates anymore. I have due weeks, which really is the same thing if a kid waits till the last minute. But it's that idea that they have the time period, they know their mental health, they can figure it out. And so many people were so angry, saying like, this is not going to teach them responsibility. And I'm like, first of all, in the real world, you are allowed to have deadlines. Our deadlines do change. And so when I really sat down to write this book, specifically, We're Also Good at Smiling, about depression, it was because I couldn't articulate what I was feeling to myself. I would go to therapy and I wouldn't cry. I would say, calculated exactly what was going on, because I had actually never investigated it. I had always just kept working and ignoring it because that's what we did. That's what silence taught us. And so when I wrote We're Also Good at Smiling, I wanted to write about a girl who was both magical, but also surrounded by magic, and this haunted garden that's filled with fairy tales like Baba Yaga. And the crazy thing about it is that even these fairy tales, who are supposed to be these whimsical things, get stuck in this garden, can have depression. It's not exclusive to a certain type of person. And trying to, in my own self, like work through that. Like, what does it mean to go through the garden? And in the book, there's an idea about going through the garden for a second time and how it always changes and it gets craftier. And it's very similar to what like Ally was talking about, is that, you know, that trauma is always going to be part of your life. And so addressing and talking about it and coming up with ways to help children articulate that or open up conversations is what's really important to me. And I was terrified to write this book. But Ally wrote her book, her haunted house book. And I decided after I read it, I was like, I can do it. I can do this too. And it's that thing. Ally spoke out. And because of that, I was like, oh, I need to write about depression. So it becomes this thing where the more people that speak out, the more people that show their truth, the more accessible it becomes and the more conversations that young people can have.
Amber, how do I speak after you? And Ally. Silence. So I guess I didn't really intend to write the book that I wrote. So I didn't really decide to write a book about grief. I decided to write a book about a girl who was living in a particular town, and I was working through it. And my critique partners at the time said, you know, well, why is she that way? So I went back and I wrote a series of vignettes that I took from my own life from when I was a child. And one of the vignettes was about losing a friend, which I did when I was much younger than my character, in second grade. And everyone said, well, that's way more interesting to read about than what you're writing. So I wrote that. And as I was writing it, like when I was first writing it, a critique, actually a mentor of mine I said, you know, I don't need to write another book about a kid losing a friend. We have those books, right? We have The Question of Miracles. We have the one that I love that I can't remember. I'm like, why do we need another book about a kid losing a friend? And this mentor said, because we haven't heard that story told from you. So I was like, oh, okay. And my book is nothing like the other two at all. And as I was writing it, what happened was I had to really, you know, I'm a parent, so I have kids, and I also experienced grief. And one of my daughters lost a friend. my other daughter's friend's dad died. And as a parent, I was felt really strongly about like facing those things head on. Like I wasn't going to not talk to my kids about it. I don't remember, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I don't remember anyone talking to me about death when I was a kid. And the facts are, all of us are going to know more than one person who's going to die, right? It's part of life. So if we don't talk about it, and if I didn't write about it, I felt if people don't write about it, if we don't talk about it, we're not actually empowering kids to like deal with it. And quite frankly, you know, with the pandemic, kids know a lot of more kids know more people who have died. So I kind of felt like it's really important to do that, to model, to show a kid going through that grieving process, because we need to teach kids how to do it, and we need to normalize it so that kids who are going through that don't feel so alone. It's the same thing. It's like if we don't talk about these things, you know, then we're alone with them, and being alone with them is not a good place to be. It's dangerous, actually, I think. So
yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing about like silence is dangerous, because as Amber said, it puts you in a little silo, and it makes you think you're the only one who's experienced this. And that is like the trauma and the fear is bad enough, but thinking that you're completely isolated and alone. And I think one of the things that's so great about books is like, yeah, I understand that these things are hard to talk about. I have trouble talking about them. I am not great at talking, but like books don't, that's just a private conversation between you and the story, you know, and it's safe, and you can put it down when you need to put it down, you know. And I just think with everything the kids have been through, with the world that they find themselves in, like I write horror for children, so I'm constantly asked, like, you know, like, oh, what, you know, is that too traumatizing for children? And I'm like, it's not. It's a safe, scary. It's a place to explore feelings that scare them, and exploring trauma. I mean, that's something you have to start doing. You know, I don't know. I think it's extremely important.
I agree. And you know, I think also that, I mean, it's not only, I mean, listen, the numbers that you quoted about kids being diagnosed with cancer, that's staggering, right? And that is so hugely important, but that's not even the only kind of trauma, right? I mean,
Right.
Kids people are traumatized all the time from like all kinds of things. And then in the past 2 years, we've all been traumatized, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, this is why also it was important to me when I wrote Disappearing House. The word cancer is only in the book one time, because I didn't want it to be a cancer book. It's a trauma book. And for me, I wanted the house to be the skeleton upon which you could coat your trauma. And I'm happy to say successful in that, because I've had many readers say, like, I didn't have cancer, but I survived an assault. Like, I know this house. I've been in this house. And I think that is valuable and useful.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that also, going off of that, I think that grief can be traumatizing. Like I think that
Absolutely.
that's something we often forget. Like, even if you're going to be facing that grief head on, it's traumatizing. And I think that grief and loss don't always mean that the loss of a person. It can be a loss of a part of yourself, a loss of I mean, I remember when I officially came out, it was a loss of having a secret that was mine that felt safe. Like, there's so many different ways that we grieve, and giving language to that, and having so more and more books that look at that from every perspective. Because I think what's interesting, like Linda was saying, you were saying, like, there's books about people whose friends have passed away, but you haven't written it. And I think that's what's really interesting when we talk about craft in writing, is that I find that the best books that I read on trauma are both a mirror and a window. So, like, a mirror in the sense that the person or the writer puts themselves in the book in this vulnerable way, but a window in the sense that they also are not just saying they're one perspective. They're also looking out and kind of creating this character that would act, I guess, in the most realistic way. And I fear that, like, because this is about writing for children, I guess, that often I see adults writing books for young or for children about trauma, and the main character is doing what they had hoped that they would have done. The child is not acting how a child would act. We're trying to save ourselves preemptively somehow, and we're not being honest in the text about this kid wasn't feeling brave. They didn't know what to do. They had to have friends. And I think that honesty of like, we can't write the child we needed when we were young. We have to write the actual truth. And I think that that's a difficult line to like figure out while you're writing these kinds of books.
Oh my God, writing the truth, right? So did you guys cry when you were writing? Because I cried so much while I was writing this book. Oh my God, I cried so much. Did you guys cry?
No, I didn't cry while I was writing it, but I have reread certain
Ally.
sections, and I've reread certain sections, and I'm just like, wow, you went there, didn't you? And I think the reason that I didn't cry is because, you know, part of the reason why I said this book was just supposed to be a file on my computer is because I always felt like it was just too Ally. It was too specific to me. And now that I read it, I see that it's decidedly not. So no, I wouldn't say. Amber, did you cry?
I have a problem. I can't really cry about myself. We're working.
I'm the only one who cried.
But I cried reading all of your books. But something Ally, that you said about you thought it was too much of an Ally book, and I've told you this before, that as a person with like severe clinical depression, there's a specific line in that book that was said, and it was talking about like, how long do you live? Like, how long do you know you're going to be well, or could you get sick again?
Yeah.
And the line, I might say it incorrectly, but it basically is, you get what everyone gets, a lifetime.
That's right.
Yeah, you
And
nailed it.
that's my
the line.
favorite. That's my favorite line of the book.
And every time I read it, I applied it to myself as well. Is like, as a person who's depressed, there's always this like lingering fear of yourself, of what I write about in the first poem, and still knowing that no matter what happens, I'm going to keep trying, but no matter what, I still have a lifetime. Like it works for so many things. And that line just stuck with me the first time I read it, and it still hits me every time I read it. It's just,
okay, now you're gonna make me cry. So
oh no.
It's not that you don't cry, Ally. You just didn't cry for this book.
Yeah,
I've made
sure,
you cry.
sure.
I've seen you cry.
Yes, I'm very comfortable with crying. We have a very comfortable relationship with each other. We've known each other for some time. But I'm glad that line mattered. That is the backbone upon which I wrote this story, because that is the thing that got me through my trauma. Because when you live your life where every 6 months you're having scans done and tests done, and you wait every 6 months to find out, are you still okay? Are you still okay? And this goes on for a decade. You know, it can really alter the way you view things. And I also kept it because, you know, like I said, most of those kids survive, and yet all of the books that they're given are like, kid gets sick, kid teaches everybody that life is important and meaningful, kid dies. And like, that's not fair. That's not fair to all the kids that lived, that they deserve a story. They deserve to see themselves, you know, windows and mirrors. They deserve to see themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
go ahead, Amber.
I was just going to say on that point as well, that they deserve to see themselves, is that I think that I'm not calling out any specific writers, but I do think we have a bit of an obsession with creating the saddest ending possible.
Yes.
As considering it as effective. You know what I mean? Like, I see so many books on depression where it's after fact, this person has already killed themselves or something like that. And like, we don't get the stories that are actually the truth, which is, you know, somewhere in the middle of that. And I worry that to get a quote reaction, we're writing these worst case scenarios, which aren't necessarily accurate. And it's interesting also when I think about my book, Me Moth, when I was writing it, I started writing it after my grandfather passed away. And it's dedicated to him, and it's about loss, and specifically within the Black community, what ancestry means. And so many people find the ending of the book, which I'm not going to say, but as sad, and I see it as hopeful. And I think that it's interesting what people define as sad or happy endings, because I think that becomes for everyone as well.
Yeah.
I also think the ending of your book is extremely hopeful. I cried my way through it because it's beyond moving. It's beyond moving, and because I realized that I had been taken on a journey I wasn't expecting. I had I was swept off my feet. I was completely like, you were the storyteller, and I was going wherever you took me. But I do think it's hopeful. Absolutely, I won't spoil it. I think the end of my book is hopeful. I think the end of Linda's book is hopeful. I think that, you know, if I'm going to write about surviving through trauma, and if I'm going to write about the kids that lived, then like, why are all the books that are out there about the kids that died or the kids that didn't make it through their depression? You know, why is that the thing? Why is that the story we think needs to be told? And that's the question I faced every morning while I was writing this book.
I feel like writing for children and teens, I think that it's important that we remember that we're grown-ups, right? And that we're grown-ups writing a book, and like, what do we want to give them, right? Do we want to give them? I don't think we need to give them a happily ever after. I mean, I don't think happy is the point, but I do think hopeful is the point, right? It's like, I feel like all of our books are like roadmaps for like how to get through something, roadmap for how to get through trauma, roadmap, you know, for dealing with depression, roadmap for, you know, grieving. And, you know, it's not the roadmap, but it's a roadmap. And we're showing them that there is a way through, right? It's like, I don't know. I just feel like I think there's a difference between happy ending and a hopeful ending. And I agree. I think all of our endings are very hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, as someone, again, who predominantly writes middle grade horror, my whole pact with my readers is that if you take my hand and we're going to go into the darkness and it's going to get scary, but I promise you, I will bring you back to the light. And it's not going to be happy, and it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be okay. Like, that's the deal I make. And I think that is teaching survival skills in this world, you know, like the ability to be in, you know, like, because at some point they're going to grow up and they're going to fight their own monster, and to be at this moment in a book, like following along while someone is battling their own demons, be it outside or inside, you know, it's a training ground. It's they get to see how it works. And yeah, I don't think happy should be the goal, but I do think that hope is important. I think that hope is important just in life in general.
Hey, Ally, when you were writing Disappearing House, and it's a book about trauma, did you feel like traumatized? Did you feel like you were reliving that, or like what did that look like for you?
So for me, yeah, but like, if I say I was re-traumatized, it sounds like it's a bad thing, and I don't mean it as a bad thing. I think that I went, like, the trauma came back to me because of things that happened in life. So the trauma was here. It was present. It demanded an audience. And I think that the writing of this book allowed me to pick it apart, to really look at it, to put it down when I needed to, you know. So yes, I was very much, while I was writing this, experiencing trauma, but in a way controlled, I guess, in a way that felt like I'm doing this to work through the things that I thought I had handled, and I clearly did not.
That's interesting.
Clearly, no. That's, I don't know. I just saw someone in the chat because I can't stop not reading the chat. I'm one of those. It's so frustrating me.
And I can't read it at all.
When we were online, like I always had to be watching both for college, but it was this idea that it was talking about death, and as Americans, we're very like bad at talking about death, or we want to protect people. And I would say that specifically for like, I guess I don't think that death within a lot of cultures with people of color, or specifically Black people, is something that we avoid, because ancestry is something that's also so close to us. But this idea, I think, often about writing these books is that if they're reading them in school, then the teachers are going to have to talk about these books. And I wonder if the teachers have the tools to talk about them. Sometimes I think about that. But I also think about how that's almost projecting your own fears onto a younger generation on what we can read or what we can talk about, which becomes a problem. But as for re-traumatizing or perhaps harming yourself, like when you're writing these things, for me, Moth, I was good. I can deal with death. I was thinking about my grandfather. It was like a memorial to him. I practice hoodoo, so it was very much an offering I took to his actual burial site. So it felt right. Now, when we started with We're All So Good at Smiling, I was moving into a depressive episode, and my therapist, my agent, and literally everyone around me was like, I don't think you should write about this right now. And I was like, no, it's going to be fine. I'm going to move through it in the same way. That didn't happen. It was extremely difficult to write. And while I was writing this book about trauma and depression, my dog also died. And the story around that is that, trigger warning for anyone who is not able to talk or listen about suicide. But when I was in college, a junior in college, I was turning 21. My mother and my father were very worried about me. They could see that I was going very much downhill in my mental health. And my mother, in her wisdom, was like, one thing about Amber is she's a nurturer. And if she is given something to take care of it, she would never leave it behind. And so my parents gave me my dog, Shiloh, German Shepherd, for my 21st birthday. And she helped immensely. And I think what I realized when she passed, and something I said in therapy, was that I thought I had gotten farther than this, but I realized I was using her as a crutch. And that was a really difficult thing to realize, and to also be writing this book that is talking so much about how the garden, hypothetically, going through any depressive episode will be different each time, and you have to kind of face it. And so it was really difficult for me to write this one. I have an amazing editor, Liz Zabla, and she really helped. But it was one of those things where craft-wise, I had to take out some things that were too accurate to my life because I could not write them. So the version that my friend Ally wrote or read is a little bit different than this one, because I had to take out the specific ones. I also had a friend who died in a freak accident falling off a swing when I was I believe 10 or 11, and that was in the book, and I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't do it. There were so many instances where I had to take that and make it more fictional, because I couldn't give the authenticity, and I couldn't touch those feelings in myself at that time. And I think that one thing that I always say, and my therapist has asked me, she was like, why did you write this book when it became so difficult? And for me, it was that it made me realize that there were no books that kind of dealt with this in a magic realism, spirituality, hoodoo kind of way. But the real answer I gave her is that young people make me brave. Like, I just knew that this book was going to help someone. And the responses we've gotten so far have been really great, but it was really difficult for me to write it. And it took a long time to get it to where we wanted it.
Yeah, it does. It takes a toll on us, right? I mean, I when I wrote Repairing the World, I wrote it. My agent sent it out on submission, and we were expecting an offer. And then my mom died, and the day after my mom died, we got the offer on the book. And then I had to revise it, and during that process, my dad also died. So I was deeply grieving while I was revising this book, and it was really it was hard, but for me there was something cathartic about it. I think maybe that's why I cried. I was literally grieving. But I think that as writers, we really do need to tell the truth, right? You know, Ally, you had to tell the truth about cancer, which is people live, right? Amber, you had to tell the truth about depression, which is like, it really is dark, you know? And I think, I just feel like, the more truthful we are, the more authentic the story is, right? I think it's like our job. I think it's our job to be as authentic as possible. I don't want to. I think kids also can see through bullshit. So.
That's the problem.
Well, yeah, and also I feel like, you know, when you're writing for children, you know, it's that whole like what's appropriate thing, like what can you talk about, what can't you talk about, and I find myself consistently reminding and repeating that, like, you know, the range of emotions that I have right now, I had those when I was 12.
I know.
Kids have the full range of human emotions. They don't always have the language for it. So like, you can't shy away from these things. You can't put it into a corner and tell them everything's fine, because they know it's not fine. They know when things are not fine. And to be lied to is just scarier.
Yeah. And then also, I think I might get this term wrong, because my therapist was talking about it. I think the term is latent vulnerability, which basically is like when these things aren't talked about, they're suppressed, and they come out in children with, quote, I don't want to say bad behavior, because I think that any behavior is just showing an emotion that is getting too much. But it might be throwing things in the classroom or anything, but nobody asked them, how was your day? Like, what's happening? And I'm not saying
what's going on at home. Exactly.
I'm not saying that like that's on teachers, because teachers have 6,000 other things, especially now, but we don't necessarily think to ask that first. And I wonder about that sometimes.
No, like, because our knee-jerk reaction is to discipline. Right. It's not to say, okay, clearly you're upset and you don't have the language to talk about what's upsetting you. So let's just.
I feel like our books are trying to give kids language, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the whole point, like I said, the whole point of this appearing house is the theme of it ultimately is the only way out is through. And it's this idea that you have to face what's in front of you in order to get out of whatever house you've built for yourself.
Right.
You know, and I think you can only do that by being honest, and you can only do that by not silencing kids and not silencing yourself, like by talking about the hard things.
Yeah, and it's like when I do a school visit and I tell students they can ask me whatever they want, immediately adults lose, they get tense. They're like, oh dear, what is going to happen? And it's like, wait a second, I'm the adult. Like, trust that I'll figure out how to navigate the situation with these kids, but I'm not going to tell them they can't ask questions that might be difficult for me to answer. You know what I mean? Like, I'm supposed to be helping them understand how to navigate their emotions. So it's always just, I think, respect. I don't think that and this is just in general and just what I see, even at the college level, the respect for young people as completely formed human beings who have feelings. I just don't see it sometimes. And I don't see it when I see a professor say something to a student like, oh, you can't turn this in late. Or in my day, even if you were at the hospital, you have done your assignment. What does that say? And what are you feeling?
Your day sounds bad.
I literally have students come to me and say that people have said these things to them. and it makes me say, like, you really just don't respect their personal wellness. And that always is slightly triggering to me, the lack of respect we have for, or some people have for, young people.
Or their autonomy, because, you know, we don't give children autonomy. We tell them what to do all of the time, you know, and I feel like I remember what it felt like to try and navigate a myriad of emotions while consistently being told what to do 99% of the day. And, you know, books were my refuge for a reason, because that was one of those places that wasn't happening.
Yeah.
I think also it's oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say that, you know, I don't think that, like, I'm not a grief expert, and I'm pretty sure Ally is not a cancer expert. Amber, I don't think you're a mental health expert. And I don't think that we need to be any of those things, even if we're talking to kids, because, you know, I think what we're, all three of us, and I know this because you guys are my friends, but all three of us are really good at being humans. And I think, you know what I mean? It's like just Amber, like what you were just talking about was like, was speaking to kids' humanity, right? And then like speaking from our own humanity. And I think that I think we're all actually quite expert at that, at like seeing other people's humanity. And I think that's what kids need. It's kind of that same thing of like talking to them like they're fully formed humans, because they literally are.
Literally.
Yeah.
I do have a question to bring about style or form when it comes to craft. I think that it's interesting because we're all writing about grief and trauma, and Ally, you're writing in horror. Linda, you're very much within you know, realism kind of happening in the real world. And I generally write or the books I have out right now are novels in verse. And I was just wondering, how did you pick that form? Why did you decide on that form? Was there ever a form that you thought you would kind of get at the story from in a different way?
I would love to address this first. So I wrote this in a realistic contemporary, but I really wanted like a patina of like fantasy on it. And I just couldn't do it. Like, it just didn't work. There was like, you know, there was something magical in the story that got taken out because it really didn't work. And I read a lot of fantasy. So I don't know if I just didn't know how to do that for this book, or if I just don't know how to do that. I think I do know how to do that. I think for this story, for me, it was so, like, I didn't know how to be metaphorical about it, is the thing. I didn't know how to be metaphorical about it. I needed to just like really just talk about the thing. So that's how it was for me.
You know, Linda, though, I feel like there is magic in your story. Like it's the magic that you constantly are looking for. It's the magical thinking that happens when you're grieving. You know, I mean, I don't know. I think it's maybe it's not as overt as you had planned it to be, but I definitely think it's there. I really think it's there. So why did I choose horror? I think that horror can talk about hard things really, really well. I think that horror as a genre is really good about talking about what makes you human, about the parts of you that might be monstrous, I think it's really good at empathy. I think that if you're going to root for a main character, you're definitely going to root for a main character in a horror novel. And the thing I love best about horror is that I think that horror allows me to talk about something that is important to me, which is this idea that anger is not bad. It's useful. And it's not something you should tell kids they shouldn't feel, or that it's wrong, because it's useful. And a big part of my story is Jack discovering her anger and using it like a blade to fight her monsters. And I think that, you know, horror just really fits into that. And also, like I said before, you know, the haunted house, you know, the whole point of it is she thinks she's hallucinating and she thinks it's not real. So the only way to prove that she's not symptomatic again is to physically go in there, and then she can't get back out because she built it. And I just think that, well, I just think horror's great, but I just think it really served this story of talking about trauma and the elasticity of trauma and what you carry and what you learn to put down and what the monsters look like when you turn the light on.
Well, reading that book totally changed my mind about horror, because it was something that I didn't really read. And then I read Ghost Girl and This Disappearing House, and all of a sudden I'm really into horror. It's a little weird.
Ally's bringing us all to the horror genre.
Come with me, little
the
friends,
thing I
around
just
the
like,
campfire.
yes, I'm just thinking a gothic novel. I want to do this. But you know, what's interesting is I get asked, I just did a chat earlier with Highlights about writing novels in verse. And I get asked about writing in verse a lot. And my background is in poetry, but my third book, which is a middle grade novel called Gone Wolf, is not in verse. And so I often get this question of why do you write in verse, or what topics do you write about in verse? And I found that for me, it was much more of when the thesis of my book was something that was more of a feeling of dissonance, it needed to be in verse. It was more of a vibe over action. So like, for example, I was much more concerned about, like, how could I explain it? There's a musicality to all my work, but the song "The Night We Met" by Lord Huron, I know a lot of people, it was in a movie soundtrack, but there's a part, the song starts off very like slow. It kind of struts along, and then before the beat like drops, and it's absolutely beautiful. I've seen it live, it's amazing. It says, "I had all of you then," or like, "I had some of them, none of you, all of them, most of you," or something like that. And then all of this music comes in. And like, for me as a verse writer, that moment right there is what I want to create. More than the story, more than anything else, it's that feeling of goosebumps you get when you hear that part of the song. And so when my subject matter is pushing on feeling more, I always go with verse. And then my book, Gone Wolf, that's coming out, which inside joke is supposed to be my banned book, is about the hypothetical reinstitutionalization of slavery in the southern states as a middle grade novel. It wasn't a feeling, it was a truth I was trying to tell, and it didn't fit in verse. So it's like, when it's a feeling that's almost dissonance, there's truth and fear at the same time, I want to write in verse. But outside of that, I lean more towards prose, but magic at all times, I think. A little witchiness everywhere. Yeah.
Well, I can believe, because it's the three of you, but I can't believe that we've been together for an hour. I think that people here would listen along for much more time. We want to be respectful of your time. We want to hear more stories and give you time to create them too. We're so grateful that you're here. There were many questions that came through, but so many of the questions naturally were responded to within your discussion. I think it's so beautiful that the three of you know one another so well that you were answering questions about each other's, stories and life as you were sharing. Some people did ask about other resources, and I did want to pop into the chat. We did put websites for the three of you, but also a great website that has a wonderful database where you can look at topics as discussed tonight, the books that are written for kids about mental health, about disability representation. It's just a fantastic resource. It's called A Novel Mind, so I'll pop that into the chat for you. Several people asked where they could see the three of you teaching somewhere again soon, and hopefully you'll keep us posted on that. Well, Linda, tomorrow.
Or maybe Highlights wants to have something by the three of us. It could happen.
I think that sounds amazing. So we'll keep you posted on that as well. One of our friends, one of our faculty members reached out this morning when she saw the post about your session and said that she will be talking about writing middle grade books that deal with loss. It's Meg Medina, and so she shared a link with me, and I'll pop that into the chat as well. Another conversation about that respect, that truth, and bringing great stories to kids. So I just want to thank the three of you so much. I want to remind everyone that a recording of tonight's conversations with captions will be sent out via email within 24 hours. I want to thank everyone out there from our Highlights Foundation team who helped make free events like this possible. We are so grateful. Thank you, Linda, Amber, and Ally. I agree. There were so many people in the chat saying, I'm nodding my head, I'm nodding my head. And it was so much of that tonight. What you've said, what you've shared is so important in the stories that we tell and what we do for kids. So I loved it. Be safe, all of you. Take care of one another. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Lovely.